Ripon's Little White Schoolhouse shows how a small community can make a big impact.
No matter your politics, this is history that you should know.
About an hour drive north of Milwaukee is Ripon, Wisconsin. Ripon's Little White Schoolhouse has made a big impact on our nation. The museum is free and welcomes thousands of visitors every year. To miss this stop would be foolish.
The city held the earliest meetings of a fledgling party and became the birthplace of the Republican Party. The new party and one of their nominees, Abraham Lincoln, were key to abolishing slavery throughout the United States.
For a long time, this area has been attracting people who thought differently and questioned conventional wisdom. Prior to Ripon's founding in 1849, an experimental utopian community was established.
The museum's director, Steve Arbaugh, told us of the history of these people.
The Wisconsin Phalanx was a group of 19 men who walked from Southport, which is now the city of Kenosha, down by the Illinois border, all the way up to central Wisconsin to Ripon, to found a utopian community. They were followers of Charles Fourier, who was a French philosopher who had an idea of communal living and that everyone would share in each other's success. In 1844, they established their community. They named their community Ceresco, which was named after the Greek goddess Ceres. It was about bounty and success. The longhouse is a concept of everybody being in one facility, whether it's a living facility. They had a longhouse for dining. Everybody took all of their, or shared all of their meals together. And the longhouse was a communal living arrangement for everybody in the community. There are any number of people in Ripon who've thought and acted differently over the years that have made a difference. Ripon was founded in 1849 by Captain David Mapes, who fell in love with the area because of the waterway. The town itself was located off of the Silver Creek. The first houses were being built around that time. At the same time, a grist mill and basic needs for families and pioneering were in this area. It was not far from Ceresco. The two communities coexisted side by side for several years. And Ceresco grew to be 200 people before it was disbanded and eventually was voted upon to merge within the city of Ripon. The people who emigrated into Ripon were heading toward what was called the New Territory or the Wisconsin Territory before it was a state. The Little White Schoolhouse was built in 1853 by the citizens of Ripon. Ceresco had already founded a school. It was a two-story octagon-shaped building, which was an interesting piece of architecture that was actually only popular in America for a short time, but there was no public school system. So the people of Ripon got together and decided that they needed to fund and put together a schoolhouse for students and children. And so they took a collection of money, and the Little White Schoolhouse was built with $400 donated by the local community. In a one-room school, children of all ages were in the same classroom. Within this room in general, there are actually 10 small blackboards, and children could be grouped together by what they were learning or where they were at in their education. You might have younger students learning to read grouped together in one corner, and on the opposite side of the room in another corner, you could have older students who are doing mathematics problems or solving issues that the teacher had brought to their attention. So everybody was learning at their own level, but there were multiple students and multiple ages. And quite often, older students were asked to look out for the younger students and offer some assistance. 1853 is the first year that the school was in business. The interesting thing is they pretty much outgrew the school right away, because by 1854 they picked the building up and moved it across the street to make room and build a much larger school, which was made of masonry. And it was a two-story structure on the same location, the first location of the Little White Schoolhouse. That building burned to the ground. They replaced that with a brick school that's still there. They turned that school building into an apartment complex. Originally, all of the one-room schoolhouses for heat in the wintertime had a stove. It was probably coal burning or wood burning in the beginning. The stoves were located in the middle of the room. Even the two-story schoolhouses were open above the stove, so it heated both the first and second floors. Students would come to school during nice weather, but they could be called out of school to help with their families' harvesting and farming issues, whether it be summertime or fall. In the state of Wisconsin, a lot of students left school to go out for hunting season with their family. And then, of course, if the weather was bad and we had really large snows in the state of Wisconsin, they would not be coming to school at all. The emphasis and focus at that time were what they called in American history the 3 R's. The 3 R's were reading, writing, and arithmetic. Those 3 areas were the most important for children before they might move on to higher education if they had an opportunity to do that. It's important to note that writing at that time was really more about penmanship than it was grammar. Ripon College began because the people coming from New York and Philadelphia voted what would be the most important thing for the city to do. There were only 11 to 14 houses in the community, so it was a very small gathering of group of people. Many of them were college educated and had lived on the East Coast. Some were lawyers, some were business people. They owned dry goods and department stores or stores downtown Ripon. And they decided that they would vote to have a college. It would be important to have higher education. Alvin Beauvais was from New York. He was a lawyer. He owned many different businesses here in Ripon, but he was also very forward-thinking. He was one of the people who founded the college, Ripon College, at a time that the community was so small. He was also thinking ahead about political issues, and he's the one who stood up and called the meetings here in Ripon. He ran the ads in the local newspaper and brought the people together to make the decision. There were 2 meetings in Ripon before the Republican Party was formed. The first took place at the Congregational Church, which still exists in Ripon at the top of the hill next to Ripon College. There were a number of people that attended. However, there are some stories that if you did not belong to that church, maybe you didn't feel like you would be attending, then the decision was made, if we're going to hold these meetings, let's hold them in a neutral place where everybody can join in, and everybody is invited. The ads in the newspaper said Nebraska Act, talked a little bit about the anti-slavery movement, asked everybody to join them at those locations, and the second meeting at the Little White Schoolhouse is where the 54 people joined, many of them who had been at the first meeting, and they made the decision to form the Republican Party. Republican was a word choice of Alvin Beauvais, who also had studied the background of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson coined a phrase, Democratic Republican, during his term as president. And what he was really talking about was our nation as a democracy and as a republic or a republica, which meant the territory or the overall being of the nation. And it was not necessarily talking about a party specifically as much as it was an entity. Alvin Beauvais then took the word Republican and understood that if it was going to represent a new political party, that he would have to talk to his friend Horace Greeley, who was the publisher of the largest newspaper and the most widely read newspaper based in New York City. When he went to Horace Greeley and he said the word Republican, Horace Greeley thought about it and came back to Alvin Beauvais, the founder of the Republican Party, and said, I think you've selected the wrong word. But Alvin Beauvais had held the meetings here in Ripon, and everybody had voted, and everybody agreed to the anti-slavery movement, and went back to Horace Greeley and said, no, Republican is the word. And that's what led everybody to name the party, and Greeley published it, and that's why everybody was learning about the new young Republican Party. When we talk about a lawyer named Beauvais, and you talk about Greeley, and you talk about who were influencing, these people were more highly educated, and they were always thinking ahead. It wasn't just traditional people getting in a wagon and going west. These people traveled here, by the way, through the Great Lakes. They took steamships from New York and Philadelphia up through the lakes. They landed in Green Bay. Then they rented a horse or a horse and buggy or a horse and wagon and came down to central Wisconsin. So they had a whole different mode of transportation on steamships than what we see maybe in the movies where people are just blindly going west. They knew where they were going. There were many different political parties in the United States. Early on, a lot of parties were just forming and just being found out as our nation was starting to mature. At the very first meeting in the Little White Schoolhouse, there were Whigs. The Whigs were a conservative party and a carryover from the Whigs in England, a very conservative group. Free Soilers was a very short-lived party. They were anti-slavery sentiment who wanted everyone to live off the land. They described themselves primarily as agrarians or farmers. And then, of course, we had the Democrats, which were supposed to be the more progressive thinkers of their time. When the people came together in the Little White Schoolhouse and they started talking about anti-slavery sentiment and they formed the Republican Party, they decided that even though they were coming from three different parties, they had to unite in order to make an impact. They came in as three groups and they walked out of the meeting as one. The party's first nominee was John C. Fremont. It's not often or always that a grassroots effort and initiative, a small group of 54 people, can stand up and make an impact on our nation. The important part of the anti-slavery sentiment here in Ripon is that the people believed that it was immoral, that it was inhumane, and it was cruel treatment of other human beings. There were many different issues culminating at the same time. There was an anti-slavery sentiment here in Ripon, and at the same time, our government put into motion the fugitive slave law. Slaves were actually escaping the South and heading north to free states, and they were also moving on beyond that into Canada. The fugitive slave law said that everybody was obligated to become a slave catcher. So if someone was traveling from the south to the north and you saw them and you suspected that they were a runaway or fugitive slave, that you would turn them into the authorities and the police. The people in Ripon had heard about that and they did not want to participate in the Fugitive Slave Act. Later, there's an event called the Booth War, and there was a publisher in Milwaukee who found out about the sentiment in Ripon and said, if in fact Ripon isn't going to do this, I'm not going to do this either, which caused him to face the possibility of being put in jail or being fined if he in fact refused to be a slave catcher. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was introduced by our government with the concept that slavery would be expanded into the Northwest Territories. Wisconsin was not a state. None of these areas further west were states. This was an emerging state. And there was a thought that slavery would end up going from Wisconsin all the way over to Minnesota and further toward the West Coast. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. Abraham Lincoln had been speaking out against slavery and had joined an anti-slavery sentiment group. And he actually started out as being born in Kentucky and was a conservative representative of the Whig Party. Eventually, going into Illinois, he was an Illinois state Democrat and realized that if he was going to run for president and if he was going to stand on the platform of anti-slavery, that he would have to be a Republican. So he joined the first Republicans in the Union. In doing so, he brought attention to the newly formed and growing Republican Party. When President Lincoln was elected in 1860, he was actually one of 4 candidates who were running for president. While he only won with 40% of the vote, he still had the majority of the vote because the other candidates had diluted down the election based on the number of people that he was running against. When he was elected president in 1860, the Civil War started 6 months after he was in office. The Civil War lasted between 1861 and 1865. Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln had long-standing debates. Stephen Douglas wanted to allow each state to make their own decision whether they would continue on supporting slavery both as a business and as a policy. What the Republican Party and the anti-slavery movement did was to redefine property as not human property. So at the time that Abraham Lincoln became president, the actual cost that measured slaves as human property was larger in our nation than the cost of durable goods. It's just an amazing thing to think about. And then what I think I want to say too is, although Abraham Lincoln was only in office for 4 years, one of the greatest challenges he faced going into his second election before he was assassinated is that he would have to help reinvent the entire U.S. economy because it had been largely built upon slavery. President Lincoln only served a very short time. It was 4 years, and he was assassinated going into his second term. He had a lot of pressure. When he went into office, he was facing states that were seceding or trying to exit the Union because they wanted to continue their economy based on slavery. And at the same time that he was trying to keep all of those states together, the nation went into war. And he knew that he wanted to free the slaves. So he was juggling a lot of very big issues and important issues.
On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in rebel states to be freed.
Unfortunately, President Lincoln did not visit the Little White Schoolhouse, but it does attract many other visitors.
While many presidents have been invited to the Little White Schoolhouse for events, they usually have a representative come speak for them. However, we do receive a lot of political candidates that visit the Little White Schoolhouse during election times. But they do stop in, and they're usually wanting to make a speech. Speeches were made in front of the front door. Ripon and the Little White Schoolhouse have celebrated the anniversaries of the Republican Party many times over. Special events include the 25th, the 50th, the 100th. We're actually coming up next year on the 125th anniversary of the founding of the party. Notably, and at the 100th anniversary, there was a day-long event throughout the entire city of Ripon. There was a miles-long parade. There was participation from Dwight Eisenhower while in Washington, and the event actually drew 45,000 people to this tiny town. The Little White Schoolhouse is a building that is visited by people from all over the world. During the month of July, we had people here from Costa Rica, Germany, France. It's quite interesting how many people are following exactly what happened at the Little White Schoolhouse and curious about the location. This building is actually available and open for events. We have groups that book in advance that come in and they hold meetings, or we have guest speakers or presenters. Quite often we're visited by the media. People want to tell the story about the founding of the Republican Party. In 1985, a structural study was made of the Little White Schoolhouse by an architecture firm out of Milwaukee. It was determined at that time that the building emulates Greek architecture because of its tall vertical lines, tall windows. It also has a very tall front door for its time period, pilaster pediment, and a peaked roof line that is very similar to a Greek architecture motif. The important thing to remember too is the Little White Schoolhouse has been moved 6 times. The schoolhouse was located sort of at the corner of Seward Street, Blackburn, and Fond du Lac Streets on a small portion of land that there actually is a former schoolhouse on today. And that more modern building was turned into an apartment complex. The Little White Schoolhouse sold, and it became a house to a private individual by the name of George Peck. George Peck was married and had 2 children. They picked the Little White Schoolhouse up and moved it to a totally different street here in Ripon into a residential area where the Peck family lived. George Peck is important to Ripon because he actually owned a Ripon newspaper. He was not afraid of controversy. He loved politics. He did not mind addressing the difficult issues of his time and his day. He was elected the governor of Wisconsin and served as a 2 times governor of the state of Wisconsin. The Little White Schoolhouse has actually always been a treasure to the city of Ripon. When Peck left Ripon, the schoolhouse was given to the college. The college used it as a museum and also gave many tours over the years. They celebrated anniversaries from the 25th to the 50th to the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Republican Party. And the building was then at some point in the early 90s given to the Ripon Chamber of Commerce. And the Ripon Chamber of Commerce has cared for the building, including a restoration that was done in 2003 to 2005 at the cost of $180,000 to refurbish the building and update inside and out, while maintaining the original design integrity of the structure itself. Recently, the Little White Schoolhouse was moved to a new location. The Little White Schoolhouse was moved to 1074 West Fond du Lac Street, which is just 1.9 miles outside of town, but it's the same highway that runs through Ripon. We're a very small community of approximately 5,500 to 7,500 people. I think the other thing that's really important about Ripon, when you look at the history, there are so many people in so many instances where people were thinking and acting differently for their time. That's really, truly inspirational. Whether it's starting with Ceresco, the fact that they were exploring a new community, which was successful until it was dissolved and merged into the city of Ripon. The founding of the Republican Party, Ceresco, a lot of times people come and they'll ask questions and they don't know that Carrie Chapman Catt is from Ripon. Carrie Chapman Catt was the president of the women's suffrage movement. And she was elected president after Susan B. Anthony retired. She actually went on and is credited with the winning strategy that tipped the vote for the 19th Amendment. And the amendment was being drafted, but she was already thinking ahead. When she finished her work for women's suffrage, she founded the League of Women Voters immediately thereafter to help educate, and it still exists today, to educate voters on what are the issues, what are the candidates, and who they should be voting for. Another person that people like to bring up is Harry Selfridge. There was recently a PBS special about Harry Selfridge, who founded Selfridge's department store in London. And he actually was born here in Ripon as well before he went to Chicago and was more or less apprenticed as a master retailer for Marshall Fields of Chicago. One frequently asked question is, how has the Republican Party evolved? I think the Republican Party has evolved like all parties and all administrations. Each of the presidents has faced the issues of their day and has to represent the people of the United States. It's not a matter of the party completely changing, it's evolving to meet the needs and meet the issues of the day.
Subscribe for more videos about historic locations.